The gaslight flickered against the laboratory walls as Nikola Tesla adjusted the copper coils of his wireless transmission apparatus. It was 1899, and the brilliant inventor stood on the precipice of a discovery that would either liberate humanity from the shackles of wired electricity or destroy him in the process. What he couldn't have known was that his work, along with that of dozens of other pioneering electrical researchers, would soon vanish into the carefully orchestrated shadows of industrial suppression. The story begins not with Tesla, but with a lesser-known figure whose fate would foreshadow the systematic destruction of free energy technologies. Dr. T. Henry Moray had spent the better part of the 1920s perfecting what he called his radiant energy device. In his modest laboratory in Salt Lake City, Moray had successfully demonstrated a machine that could generate substantial electrical power without any conventional fuel source. Witnesses, including respected engineers and scientists, watched in amazement as his device powered banks of lights and electric motors, drawing energy from what Moray described as cosmic radiation. The device itself was deceptively simple in appearance, a collection of tubes, coils, and what Moray called his Swedish stone, a peculiar mineral he had discovered that seemed to act as a conductor for ambient energy. Government officials took notice, and representatives from major electrical corporations began making inquiries. But, rather than celebration, Moray's breakthrough was met with a campaign of harassment that would ultimately destroy both his work and his life. One night in 1940, armed intruders broke into Moray's laboratory. They didn't steal money or conventional valuables. Instead, they methodically destroyed his equipment with hammers, paying particular attention to his carefully crafted Swedish stones. The irreplaceable components, which had taken him decades to perfect, were reduced to worthless fragments. When Moray attempted to rebuild, he found that his suppliers of rare materials had mysteriously become unavailable, and his financial backers had withdrawn their support without explanation. This pattern of discovery followed by systematic destruction had actually begun much earlier with the work of John Worrell Keely in the 1870s. Keely claimed to have discovered a new form of energy he called etheric force, which could be harnessed through what he termed sympathetic vibrations. His demonstrations in Philadelphia attracted wealthy investors and scientific observers who watched his motors run without steam, electricity, or any other conventional power source. Keely's machines operated through a complex arrangement of resonating chambers and vibrating elements that seemed to tap into an inexhaustible source of energy. The Keely Motor Company was formed with considerable fanfare and investment, but Keely found himself under increasing pressure to reveal his secrets to industrial interests. When he refused to fully disclose his methods, claiming they were too dangerous in the wrong hands, a systematic campaign began to discredit him. Newspapers suddenly began publishing articles questioning his credibility. Former supporters withdrew their backing, and Keely found himself embroiled in costly legal battles that drained his resources and prevented him from continuing his research. After Keely's death in 1898, investigators searching his workshop claimed to have found evidence of fraud, hidden air pressure lines that supposedly explained his demonstrations. However, witnesses who had observed his work closely noted that these alleged fraudulent mechanisms could not possibly have accounted for the phenomena they had witnessed. The destruction of Keely's reputation became a template for how future free energy inventors would be handled. Tesla's own experiences with suppression were more subtle, but no less effective. His experiments at Colorado Springs in 1899 had demonstrated that electrical energy could be transmitted wirelessly through the Earth itself. Tesla had successfully lit banks of incandescent bulbs at a distance of 26 miles without any connecting wires, proving that the planet could serve as a conductor for electrical transmission. His vision was of a world where electricity would be as freely available as the air we breathe, transmitted through a global system that would make power lines and electrical bills obsolete. The industrialist J.P. Morgan initially backed Tesla's wireless transmission project, providing funding for the construction of the massive Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island. But when Tesla revealed that his system would provide free electricity to anyone with a simple receiving device. Morgan abruptly withdrew his support. The financier reportedly stated that he could see no way to put a meter on it, meaning no method to charge consumers for the power they received. Tesla's funding dried up almost immediately. The Wardenclyffe Tower, which had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to construct, was abandoned and eventually demolished for scrap metal. Tesla's later attempts to interest other investors in wireless power transmission were met with polite disinterest or outright hostility from the established electrical industry. The inventor, who had once been celebrated as a visionary genius, found himself increasingly marginalized and his most revolutionary discoveries buried. The suppression wasn't limited to individual inventors. Entire areas of research began to disappear from academic institutions and scientific journals. Studies of atmospheric electricity, earth currents, and what researchers called radiant energy gradually vanished from university curricula. Students who showed interest in these fields found themselves steered toward more conventional areas of electrical research. Nathan Stubblefield's work in wireless power transmission suffered a similar fate. This Kentucky farmer and inventor had successfully demonstrated wireless transmission of both voice and power as early as 1892, predating Marconi's wireless telegraph by several years. Stubblefield's system could light incandescent bulbs and power motors at considerable distances without any visible connection to a power source. His demonstrations attracted national attention, and he was invited to display his technology in major cities. However, when Stubblefield began discussing the commercial potential of free wireless power, the enthusiasm of potential backers quickly cooled. Mysterious technical problems began plaguing his demonstrations. Equipment that had worked flawlessly in his Kentucky laboratory would inexplicably fail during public presentations. Stubblefield became convinced that his competitors were sabotaging his work, but he could never prove it. Financial pressures mounted as Stubblefield struggled to continue his research without adequate funding. He became increasingly reclusive, distrustful of outsiders, and protective of his technological secrets. When he died in 1928, his laboratory was quickly cleared out by unknown parties, and his research notes disappeared. Like so many other free energy pioneers, Stubblefield's work vanished with him. The pattern was remarkably consistent across dozens of inventors throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Researchers would achieve breakthrough demonstrations of wireless power transmission or atmospheric energy collection, attract initial interest and investment, then suddenly find themselves facing inexplicable obstacles. Equipment would malfunction at crucial moments, funding would disappear, and the inventors themselves would often meet untimely ends or retreat into obscurity. Dr. Wilhelm Reich's experiments with what he called orgone energy in the 1940s and 1950s followed this familiar trajectory. Reich claimed to have developed devices that could collect atmospheric energy and concentrate it for various applications, including electrical power generation. His orgone accumulators were simple box-like structures lined with alternating layers of organic and metallic materials that Reich claimed could harness ambient energy from the atmosphere. Reich's work attracted the attention of prominent scientists, including Albert Einstein, who initially showed interest in the energy accumulation experiments. However, when Reich began claiming that his devices could generate electrical power without conventional fuel, academic interest turned to hostility. The FDA launched an investigation into Reich's work, claiming his devices were fraudulent medical equipment. In a move that was unprecedented in American scientific history, a federal court ordered the destruction of Reich's research materials and equipment. Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court when he refused to stop his research, and he died in federal prison in 1957. His books were burned by federal agents, and his research equipment was destroyed under court order. The systematic destruction of Reich's work removed another potential pathway to free energy technology. Meanwhile, Other inventors learned to keep their discoveries secret rather than risk the fate that had befallen their predecessors. Professor John Christie of London claimed to have developed a device that could power automobiles by extracting energy directly from atmospheric radiation. Christie's car reportedly ran for hundreds of miles without gasoline or any other conventional fuel, drawing power from a small antenna array connected to his atmospheric energy collector. But Christie refused to demonstrate his technology publicly or seek commercial backing, having observed what had happened to earlier inventors. He took his secrets to the grave, leaving only tantalizing hints about the principles underlying his atmospheric energy system. Similar stories emerged from around the world. In Germany, Hans Kohler developed what he called the Magnetstrom apparatus, a device that allegedly generated electrical current through the manipulation of magnetic fields. The device consisted of a complex arrangement of magnets, coils, and conductors that supposedly produced a steady electrical output without any external power source. German military officials showed interest in Kohler's work during World War II, but the technology disappeared during the chaos of the war's end. Kohler himself vanished, and his research was never recovered. Some researchers have speculated that his work was seized by Allied intelligence agencies and classified as secret military technology. The systematic suppression wasn't limited to technological innovations. Financial and legal mechanisms were also employed to prevent free energy technologies from reaching the public. Patent applications for wireless power transmission devices were routinely rejected by patent offices, often on the grounds that they violated known laws of physics. Inventors found it nearly impossible to obtain legal protection for their discoveries, leaving them vulnerable to theft or suppression by larger interests. Investment capital for free energy research became increasingly difficult to obtain as word spread through financial circles that such technologies were not commercially viable. Banks and investors who had initially shown interest in revolutionary electrical innovations began demanding proof of profitability through conventional metering and distribution systems. When inventors couldn't demonstrate how their free energy devices could generate revenue through traditional utility models, funding disappeared. The electrical utility industry itself played a crucial role in the suppression. Companies that had invested billions in power plants, transmission lines, and distribution networks had little interest in technologies that would make their infrastructure obsolete. Industry groups began funding research into the theoretical impossibility of free energy devices, producing scientific papers that claimed such technologies violated fundamental laws of physics. Academic institutions, dependent on funding from established industries and government agencies, gradually eliminated research programs that investigated unconventional energy sources. Students and professors who showed interest in wireless power transmission or atmospheric energy were discouraged or redirected toward more conventional areas of study. The very concepts began to disappear from scientific discourse. Government agencies also played a role in the suppression, though their motivations were different from those of private industry. National security concerns led to the classification of any technology that could potentially be weaponized or that might disrupt economic stability. Energy technologies that could make populations less dependent on centralized power systems were seen as potentially destabilizing to social order. The story of Philo T. Farnsworth's nuclear fusion research illustrates how even promising conventional energy technologies could be suppressed when they threatened existing interests. Farnsworth, best known as the inventor of electronic television, spent his later years developing a device called a fusor that could achieve nuclear fusion at relatively low temperatures and pressures. His fusion device actually worked, producing neutrons through nuclear reactions in a desktop-sized apparatus. Major corporations showed initial interest in Farnsworth's fusion technology, but when it became clear that the device could potentially be scaled up to provide cheap, clean energy, corporate support evaporated. Farnsworth found himself unable to secure funding for further development, and his fusion research was effectively abandoned. Like so many other revolutionary energy technologies, Farnsworth's fusor disappeared into obscurity despite its demonstrated viability. By the 1960s, the suppression of free energy technologies had become so systematic that most researchers had either abandoned their work or learned to keep their discovery secret. The few inventors who continued their research operated in isolation, afraid to share their findings with colleagues or seek commercial development. The knowledge that had once promised to revolutionize human civilization was scattered and lost, buried in forgotten patents, destroyed laboratories, and the graves of silenced inventors. The infrastructure for centralized electrical power generation and distribution had become so entrenched that alternatives were literally unthinkable to most people. The lost technologies represented more than just scientific curiosities. They embodied a fundamentally different vision of how human society might organize itself around energy abundance rather than scarcity. In a world where electricity was as free and available as sunlight, the entire structure of industrial civilization would have developed along radically different lines. Cities might have been designed without massive power plants and transmission networks. Transportation could have been revolutionized by vehicles that drew power wirelessly from atmospheric sources. Manufacturing and agriculture might have achieved levels of efficiency and abundance that would have eliminated much human want and suffering. Instead, the suppression of these technologies helped ensure that human civilization would develop along lines that benefited established industrial and financial interests. Energy scarcity became a tool of social control, ensuring that populations would remain dependent on centralized systems and vulnerable to economic manipulation. The inventors who had glimpsed this alternative future paid a heavy price for their visions. Tesla died alone and nearly penniless in a New York hotel room, his greatest discoveries locked away in government vaults or lost forever. Murray spent his final years as a broken man, his life's work destroyed, and his reputation ruined by systematic harassment. Stubblefield died in poverty and obscurity, his revolutionary communications and power technologies forgotten. Their stories stand as testament to what humanity might have achieved if scientific discovery had been allowed to proceed without interference from vested interests. The wireless transmission of electrical power, the harnessing of atmospheric energy, and the manipulation of subtle forces that Tesla called cosmic energy might have created a world of unprecedented abundance and freedom. But that world was never allowed to come into being. Instead, the 19th and early 20th centuries saw the systematic destruction of technologies that could have liberated humanity from energy scarcity and the power structures built upon it. The lost current of free electricity remains one of history's greatest tragedies, a reminder of how innovation can be strangled by those who profit from artificial scarcity and technological limitation. The echo of these suppressed technologies can still be heard in the margins of modern science, in the work of researchers who continue to investigate atmospheric electricity, zero-point energy, and wireless power transmission. Their struggles mirror those of their predecessors, as they face skepticism, ridicule, and the institutional barriers that protect established energy systems. Perhaps most tragically, the destruction of these technologies was so complete that modern science has largely forgotten they ever existed. The possibility of wireless power transmission and atmospheric energy collection has been relegated to the realm of science fiction, dismissed as impossible by scientists who have never seriously studied the work of Tesla, Murray, Stubblefield, and their contemporaries. The legacy of the suppressed inventors lives on in the form of our continued dependence on centralized energy systems, fossil fuels, and the artificial scarcity that maintains existing power structures. Every electric bill, every power plant, and every transmission line stands as a monument to technologies that were deliberately prevented from reaching their full potential. Yet the physical principles that these inventors discovered have not changed. The atmospheric electricity that Tesla harnessed still flows around our planet. The cosmic radiation that Murray tapped remains as abundant as ever. The vibrational forces that Keely accessed continue to permeate the universe. The destruction of the technologies and their inventors did not eliminate the natural phenomena they sought to harness. In recent decades, some researchers have attempted to reconstruct the lost technologies based on surviving documents, photographs, and witness accounts. Their efforts have met with varying degrees of success, though they continue to face many of the same obstacles that destroyed their predecessors. The established energy industry remains as resistant to disruption as ever, and the institutional mechanisms for suppressing revolutionary technologies have only become more sophisticated. The story of suppressed free electricity technologies serves as a cautionary tale about the relationship between scientific discovery and established power. It demonstrates how technologies that could benefit all humanity can be destroyed to protect the interests of a few. Most importantly, it reminds us that the future is not predetermined, that the world we inhabit today is the result of conscious choices about which technologies were allowed to develop and which were systematically suppressed. The inventors who discovered these technologies believed they were working toward a better future for humanity. Their vision of abundant, freely available energy represented a path toward greater human freedom and prosperity. That path was deliberately blocked, not by the laws of physics, but by the calculated actions of those who profited from energy scarcity. Understanding this history is crucial for anyone seeking to comprehend the true potential of human technological achievement. The technologies that were destroyed in the 19th and early 20th centuries might have created a fundamentally different world, one where energy abundance rather than scarcity shaped the development of human civilization. The suppression of free electricity technologies represents one of the greatest crimes against human progress in recorded history. It stands as proof that technological development is not simply a matter of scientific advancement, but a complex interplay of discovery, economics, politics, and power. The lost current of free electricity continues to flow through the hidden channels of suppressed knowledge, waiting for a time when humanity might finally be ready to claim its electrical inheritance. To write more and start form rear, you left 10:05 untitled text. The suppression of free electricity technologies represents one of the greatest crimes against human progress in recorded history. It stands as proof that technological development is not simply a matter of scientific advancement, but a complex Enter the Chronicle continues to unfold, revealing layer upon layer of the systematic destruction that reshaped the course of human civilization. In the decades following the initial wave of suppression, new technologies emerged that could have restored humanity's access to abundant energy, only to meet the same fate as their predecessors. The work of Victor Schauberger in Austria during the 1930s and 1940s represented another lost opportunity for revolutionary energy generation. Schauberger, a forest warden who had spent decades observing the movement of water in mountain streams, discovered what he called implosion energy, a form of power generation based on the natural spiraling motions he observed in flowing water. Schauberger's devices used carefully designed spiral chambers and rotating elements to create what he described as a biological vacuum that could generate substantial mechanical power. His prototypes successfully powered generators and motors, demonstrating that energy could be extracted from the motion of fluids following natural patterns rather than the explosive combustion that characterized conventional engines. The implications of Schauberger's discoveries extended far beyond simple energy generation. His understanding of natural fluid dynamics led him to develop technologies for water purification, soil regeneration, and even aircraft propulsion. He built working prototypes of disc-shaped flying machines that used implosion principles to generate lift and thrust without conventional propulsion systems. But, like his predecessors, Schauberger found his work suppressed by forces beyond his control. During World War II, both German and American military officials showed intense interest in his technologies, particularly the anti-gravity applications. Schauberger was forced to work on military projects against his will, and much of his research was classified and confiscated. After the war, American intelligence agents brought Schauberger to the United States under circumstances that amounted to technological kidnapping. He was forced to sign agreements that surrendered his patent rights and prohibited him from continuing his research. When he finally returned to Austria, his health was broken and his laboratory equipment had been destroyed. Like Tesla, Moray, and so many others, Schauberger took his secrets to the grave, another victim of the systematic suppression of revolutionary energy technologies. The pattern had become so predictable that some inventors learned to anticipate it and took extraordinary precautions to protect their discoveries. Lester Hendershot developed a fuelless motor in the 1920s that allegedly generated electrical power through the interaction of magnetic fields with the Earth's natural rotation. Hendershot's device consisted of a complex arrangement of coils, magnets, and capacitors that supposedly resonated with planetary magnetic forces. Demonstrations of Hendershot's motor attracted considerable attention from investors and military officials, but Hendershot had studied the fate of previous inventors and was determined not to repeat their mistakes. He refused to reveal the complete operating principles of his device, keeping crucial components secret and building multiple versions with different configurations to prevent reverse engineering. But Hendershot's precautions ultimately proved futile. His laboratory was burglarized repeatedly, and his prototype devices were stolen or destroyed. Financial backers withdrew their support after receiving threats from unknown parties, and Hendershot himself was subjected to harassment that included death threats against his family. He was forced to abandon his research and spent his final years in obscurity, another brilliant inventor silenced by the machinery of suppression. The emergence of nuclear technology in the 1940s provided new opportunities for both energy abundance and technological suppression. While the destructive applications of nuclear fission captured public attention through atomic bombs and nuclear weapons, peaceful applications of nuclear technology promised to fulfill many of the same goals that wireless power transmission had offered decades earlier. Nuclear power plants could theoretically generate vast amounts of electricity at very low marginal costs. The fuel requirements were minimal compared to coal or oil-fired plants, and the technology offered the possibility of energy abundance that could revolutionize human civilization. Some nuclear pioneers envisioned a future where electricity would be too cheap to meter, essentially free for all practical purposes. But the peaceful development of nuclear technology was constrained by many of the same forces that had suppressed earlier free energy technologies. The massive capital requirements for nuclear plant construction ensured that only large corporations and government agencies could develop the technology. The complexity and danger of nuclear systems created dependencies on specialized expertise and regulatory oversight that made decentralized development impossible. More importantly, the same financial and industrial interests that had suppressed wireless power transmission now controlled nuclear development. The promise of abundant, cheap energy was systematically betrayed as nuclear technology was developed in ways that maintained the profitable scarcity of the existing energy system. Nuclear plants were deliberately designed to be expensive, complex, and dependent on centralized control systems that preserve the power structures of the fossil fuel era. Dr. Eugene Malov's research into cold fusion in the 1980s and 1990s revealed that the suppression mechanisms had become even more sophisticated as they adapted to new technological possibilities. Malov, MIT-trained scientist and science writer, investigated claims that nuclear fusion could occur at relatively low temperatures using simple desktop apparatus, a discovery that could potentially provide abundant, clean energy using common materials. Malov's investigations revealed that cold fusion phenomena were real and reproducible, despite widespread claims that the original experiments by Pons and Fleischmann had been debunked. His book, Fire from Ice, documented dozens of successful replications of cold fusion experiments by researchers around the world, demonstrating that the technology had been prematurely dismissed by the scientific establishment. But Malov's efforts to bring cold fusion research into the mainstream were met with the same systematic opposition that had destroyed earlier free energy technologies. His academic career was sabotaged, his research funding was cut, and he was subjected to professional ridicule designed to destroy his credibility. Scientific journals refused to publish papers reporting positive cold fusion results, and researchers who continued their work found themselves marginalized and excluded from academic positions. The suppression of cold fusion research was more subtle than the crude destruction visited upon earlier inventors, but it was equally effective. Rather than destroying laboratories or threatening researchers directly, the suppression operated through institutional mechanisms that controlled scientific funding, publication, and career advancement. Scientists who wanted to maintain their professional standing learned to avoid cold fusion research, effectively self-censoring to protect their careers. Malov himself met a violent end in 2004, beaten to death in circumstances that remain officially unsolved. His death occurred just as he was preparing to release information about successful cold fusion replications that could have revolutionized energy technology. Like so many researchers before him, Malov took crucial knowledge to his grave, another casualty in the century-long war against energy abundance. The development of the Internet and global communications in the 1990s and 2000s offered new possibilities for sharing suppressed knowledge and coordinating resistance to technological suppression. Inventors working on free energy devices could now communicate with each other across vast distances, share research results, and build communities of support that transcended national boundaries. But the same communications technologies that offered hope for preserving suppressed knowledge also provided new tools for those seeking to control and manipulate information. Government agencies developed sophisticated capabilities for monitoring internet communications, tracking researchers, and disrupting online communities that shared sensitive technological information. The phenomenon of internet scrubbing emerged as websites documenting free energy technologies mysteriously disappeared, often replaced with error messages or redirects to disinformation sites. Video demonstrations of working free energy devices were removed from platforms like YouTube, often with explanations that they violated community standards or contained misleading information. Social media platforms began using algorithmic suppression to limit the reach of content related to alternative energy technologies. Posts about free energy devices would be shadow banned, remaining visible to their authors but hidden from other users. Discussion groups focused on these topics found their membership artificially limited and their content suppressed by automated systems that claimed to be fighting misinformation. The emergence of fact-checking organizations provided another mechanism for suppressing information about alternative energy technologies. These organizations, often funded by the same corporate interests that benefited from energy scarcity, would label reports about free energy devices as false or misleading based on claims that such technologies violated known laws of physics. But these fact checks were often based on incomplete information or deliberately distorted interpretations of the underlying science. The fact checkers rarely examined actual experimental data or spoke with researchers who had replicated the phenomena in question. Instead, they relied on statements from establishment scientists who had financial or professional interests in maintaining the status quo. The result was a new form of intellectual censorship that was more effective than physical suppression because it operated through seemingly neutral and authoritative sources. People who might have been curious about alternative energy technologies were discouraged from investigating further by authoritative-seeming statements that such research was pseudoscientific or fraudulent. Educational institutions adapted to these new realities by implementing increasingly sophisticated forms of intellectual control. Students who showed interest in unconventional energy research were no longer simply discouraged or redirected. They were subjected to psychological evaluations designed to identify conspiracy thinking or anti-scientific attitudes. Universities began requiring students to sign agreements acknowledging that certain topics were off-limits for research projects. Academic advisors were trained to identify and report students who showed interest in fringe science topics. The intellectual freedom that had once characterized higher education was systematically dismantled in favor of rigid conformity to approved research directions. Professional licensing boards for engineers and other technical professionals began including questions about scientific integrity that were designed to identify and exclude practitioners who might be sympathetic to alternative energy research. Professional societies updated their codes of ethics to prohibit members from promoting unscientific technologies, with violations subject to expulsion and loss of professional credentials. The result was the creation of a self-policing system that made formal suppression unnecessary. Scientists and engineers learned to avoid certain topics not because of direct threats, but because they understood that their professional survival depended on conformity to approved research directions. The suppression had become internalized, operating through the career incentives and social pressures that shape professional behavior. Meanwhile, the technologies themselves continued to be developed in secret by researchers who had learned to operate outside the official scientific establishment. Backyard inventors, independent researchers, and underground networks of engineers continued to build and test free energy devices, often achieving remarkable results despite their isolation from mainstream scientific resources. These underground researchers developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection and suppression. They learned to use coded language when discussing their work, to disguise their devices as conventional equipment, and to compartmentalize their knowledge to prevent complete loss if they were discovered and silenced. Some researchers began building intentional flaws into their published designs, keeping the crucial information needed for proper operation secret, while releasing enough information to allow serious researchers to complete the devices through experimentation. This approach protected the inventors from immediate suppression while preserving the possibility that their knowledge could eventually be reconstructed and utilized. The development of cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies in the 2010s offered new possibilities for funding and organizing free energy research outside the control of traditional financial institutions. Researchers could potentially receive funding from anonymous supporters around the world without relying on banks or government agencies that might be subject to pressure from established energy interests. But these technological solutions also attracted new forms of suppression. Government agencies began developing capabilities for tracking cryptocurrency transactions and identifying the participants in blockchain networks. Exchanges that facilitated cryptocurrency trading were subjected to increasingly strict regulations that made it difficult to use these systems for sensitive research funding. The ongoing evolution of suppression mechanisms reveals the adaptability and persistence of the forces that have prevented free energy technologies from reaching public development. Each new technological possibility that offers hope for bypassing existing control systems is met with new forms of surveillance, regulation, and suppression that preserve the essential structure of artificial energy scarcity. The cumulative effect of more than a century of technological suppression has been to create a world where abundance is possible, but deliberately prevented, where human potential is constrained not by natural limits, but by artificial barriers erected to protect the interests of those who profit from scarcity and limitation. The story of suppressed free electricity technologies continues to unfold in the present day, as new inventors discover principles that could revolutionize energy generation only to face the same systematic opposition that destroyed their predecessors. The methods have evolved and become more sophisticated, but the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Revolutionary technologies that could liberate humanity from artificial limitations are prevented from development by those who benefit from maintaining control over essential resources. Understanding this history provides crucial insight into the true nature of technological progress and the forces that shape which innovations are allowed to develop. The future of human civilization may depend on finding ways to overcome these suppression mechanisms and, finally, claim the technological inheritance that has been denied for more than a century. The lost current of free electricity still flows through the hidden channels of suppressed knowledge, waiting for the moment when humanity will finally be ready to break free from the artificial constraints that have limited human potential for far too long. The question remains whether that moment will arrive before the accumulated consequences of technological suppression create irreversible damage to human civilization and the planetary environment that sustains it. The suppression of free electricity technologies represents one of the greatest crimes against human progress in recorded history. It stands as proof that technological development is not simply a matter of scientific advancement, but a complex interplay of discovery, economics, politics, and power. The lost current of free electricity continues to flow through the hidden channels of suppressed knowledge, waiting for a time when humanity might finally be ready to claim its electrical inheritance. The network of suppression extended far beyond individual inventors and their immediate persecutors. A complex web of interconnected interests had formed by the early 20th century, linking financial institutions, industrial corporations, government agencies, and academic establishments in a conspiracy of silence that would reshape the trajectory of human technological development for generations. The banking houses of New York and London played a particularly crucial role in this systematic destruction of revolutionary energy technologies. The Rothschild banking empire, which had financed much of Europe's industrial infrastructure, recognized early that free energy technologies posed an existential threat to the debt-based economic system that had made them wealthy beyond measure. If electricity could be freely available to all, the massive loans required for power plant construction, coal mining operations, and electrical distribution networks would become worthless overnight. J.P. Morgan's withdrawal of support from Tesla's Wardenclyffe project was not an isolated decision made by a single financier. It represented a coordinated policy decision made at the highest levels of international finance. Secret meetings were held in the private clubs of Manhattan and the boardrooms of London, where the titans of industry and banking agreed that free energy technologies must never be allowed to reach commercial development. The oil industry, still in its infancy during Tesla's era, would later become one of the most ruthless opponents of free energy research. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil empire had initially focused on kerosene for lighting and industrial lubricants, but as electricity began to replace gas lighting in cities, oil executives realized that their future lay in fueling the power plants that generated electrical current. The development of oil-fired power stations created a symbiotic relationship between the petroleum industry and electrical utilities that would prove immensely profitable for both. Free electricity technologies threatened to destroy this relationship before it could fully mature. Rockefeller began quietly funding efforts to discredit atmospheric energy research and wireless power transmission, using his vast financial resources to corrupt scientific institutions and manipulate public opinion. The steel industry also had enormous stakes in maintaining the status quo of wired electrical distribution. Companies like Carnegie Steel and U.S. Steel had invested heavily in the infrastructure for producing the massive quantities of wire, cable, and structural steel required for electrical transmission systems. Andrew Carnegie himself was known to have expressed private concerns about Tesla's wireless transmission experiments, recognizing that success would eliminate the need for much of the steel his companies produced. Academic institutions, dependent on donations from these industrial magnates, began subtly altering their curricula to discourage investigation into unconventional energy sources. Professors who showed interest in wireless power transmission or atmospheric electricity found their research funding cut and their academic prospects diminished. Graduate students were steered away from these fields, and entire departments that had once investigated electromagnetic phenomena beyond conventional electrical theory were quietly eliminated. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which had been a center for advanced electrical research, underwent a particularly dramatic transformation. In the 1890s, MIT's electrical engineering program had included serious study of atmospheric electricity and wireless power transmission. Faculty members had corresponded with Tesla and other pioneers, and students have been encouraged to explore unconventional approaches to electrical generation and distribution. But as MIT became increasingly dependent on donations from industrial corporations, the institution's research focus shifted dramatically. By 1910, any mention of wireless power transmission or free energy had been eliminated from the curriculum. Professors who had once encouraged such research either changed their focus or left the institution altogether. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, most electrical engineers graduating from MIT were unaware that such technologies had ever been seriously considered. The transformation wasn't limited to American institutions. Cambridge and Oxford universities in England underwent similar changes, as did the technical universities of Germany and France. A coordinated effort was underway to eliminate knowledge of free energy technologies from the world's centers of higher learning. The role of government in this suppression was more complex and varied depending on national interests and political circumstances. In the United States, government involvement was initially limited to patent office rejections and occasional security classifications. But as the military implications of advanced electrical technologies became apparent, government agencies began taking a more active role in controlling research and development. The establishment of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in 1908 coincided with increased surveillance of inventors working on revolutionary energy technologies. FBI files, later released through Freedom of Information Act requests, revealed extensive monitoring of Tesla's activities during his final decades. Government agents tracked his correspondence, monitored his laboratory work, and maintained detailed records of his research progress. When Tesla died in 1943, FBI agents were among the first to arrive at his hotel room. They confiscated his research papers, laboratory notes, and experimental equipment before any family members or colleagues could examine them. Much of this material was classified and has never been released to the public despite numerous legal challenges and congressional inquiries. The military applications of wireless power transmission were obvious to government planners. A technology that could beam electrical energy across vast distances could potentially be weaponized, either as a means of powering remote military installations or as a directed energy weapon. The same principles that could provide free electricity to cities could theoretically be used to disable enemy equipment or even cause atmospheric disturbances. Government suppression took on an international dimension during the two world wars. German research into unconventional energy sources, including the work of Hans Kohler and other scientists, became a priority target for Allied intelligence services. Scientific documents were seized, researchers were captured or eliminated, and entire laboratories were destroyed to prevent these technologies from falling into enemy hands. But the suppression wasn't limited to wartime activities. Even during peacetime, government agencies worked to ensure that free energy technologies remained classified or were developed only under strict military control. The Atomic Energy Commission, established in 1946, claimed jurisdiction over any research that could potentially lead to new forms of energy generation, effectively bringing all advanced energy research under government oversight. The creation of the National Security Agency in 1952 provided another mechanism for controlling information about advanced energy technologies. The NSA's charter included monitoring and controlling the dissemination of scientific information that could affect national security, a mandate broad enough to encompass virtually any revolutionary energy research. Private inventors working on free energy devices found themselves subject to national security letters that prohibited them from discussing their work or seeking commercial development. These legal instruments, issued in secret and backed by severe criminal penalties, effectively silenced researchers without requiring public disclosure of the suppressed technologies. The pharmaceutical industry also had unexpected connections to the suppression of free energy technologies. Many of the early atmospheric energy researchers had discovered that their devices produced unusual health effects in addition to generating electrical power. Dr. T. Henry Moray noted that people working near his radiant energy devices seemed to experience improved health and vitality. Similar observations were made by researchers working with Tesla's wireless transmission equipment and Reich's orgone accumulators. These health effects threatened the emerging pharmaceutical industry's business model, which was increasingly based on treating chronic diseases rather than promoting health and vitality. If atmospheric energy devices could improve human health while simultaneously providing free electricity, they posed a double threat to established medical and energy industries. Pharmaceutical companies began funding research designed to discredit the health effects of atmospheric energy devices. Studies were commissioned that claimed to show harmful effects from prolonged exposure to the electromagnetic fields generated by free energy devices. Medical journals published papers warning of potential health risks, despite the fact that many of these studies were methodologically flawed or based on deliberately distorted data. The suppression campaign was so successful that by the 1950s, most scientists believed that wireless power transmission was impossible and that atmospheric electricity could not be harnessed for practical purposes. Textbooks were rewritten to emphasize the impossibility of free energy, and students were taught that such concepts violated fundamental laws of physics. This educational propaganda was reinforced by popular media, which portrayed free energy inventors as deluded eccentrics or outright frauds. Hollywood films depicted scientists working on wireless power transmission as mad inventors whose devices inevitably exploded in spectacular failures. Popular science magazines published articles ridiculing the concept of free electricity and explaining why it could never work. The systematic destruction of alternative technological paths had profound implications for human civilization that extended far beyond the energy sector. The centralized model of electrical generation and distribution that emerged in the absence of wireless power transmission created dependencies that shaped urban planning, industrial development, and social organization for the next century. Cities were designed around the need for massive power plants and extensive transmission networks. Industrial facilities were located based on their proximity to electrical infrastructure rather than other factors that might have promoted more efficient or sustainable development. Transportation systems were built around fossil fuel consumption rather than wireless electrical power, leading to the automobile-dependent suburban sprawl that characterized much of 20th century development. The environmental implications were equally severe. The continued dependence on fossil fuels for electricity generation led to unprecedented levels of air and water pollution. Coal-burning power plants released vast quantities of smoke and ash into the atmosphere, while oil-fired generators contributed to the accumulation of greenhouse gases that would eventually threaten global climate stability. If Tesla's vision of wireless power transmission had been allowed to develop, the environmental history of the 20th century might have been radically different. Clean, abundant energy could have powered industrial development without the massive pollution that characterized the fossil fuel era. Transportation systems based on wireless electrical power could have prevented the accumulation of carbon dioxide that now threatens global climate stability. The social implications were equally profound. The concentration of energy production in large, centralized facilities created new forms of economic and political power that shaped the development of modern society. Utility companies became some of the most powerful corporations in the world, wielding enormous influence over government policy and economic development. Energy scarcity became a tool of social control, ensuring that populations remained dependent on centralized systems and vulnerable to economic manipulation. The need to pay for electricity created new forms of debt and financial dependency that tied individuals and communities to the industrial system in ways that would have been unnecessary in a world of abundant, freely available energy. The suppression of free energy technologies also had implications for human consciousness and psychological development. The knowledge that abundant energy was possible but deliberately denied created a subtle but pervasive sense of artificial limitation that affected how people thought about technology, progress, and human potential. Generations grew up believing that energy scarcity was a natural law rather than an artificially maintained condition. This belief in scarcity extended beyond energy to influence attitudes toward economics, politics, and social organization. The idea that there was not enough to go around became a fundamental assumption that justified competition, conflict, and inequality. The psychological impact on the inventors themselves was devastating. Tesla spent his final decades increasingly isolated and paranoid, convinced that his discoveries were being suppressed by a vast conspiracy, but unable to prove it or fight back effectively. He died believing that his greatest contributions to humanity would never be recognized or utilized. Murray became similarly paranoid after the destruction of his laboratory, refusing to trust anyone with complete knowledge of his devices and taking crucial secrets to his grave. Stubblefield retreated into rural isolation, abandoning his research and living as a hermit until his death. The pattern was repeated dozens of times, as brilliant inventors were broken by the systematic suppression of their life's work. The few researchers who attempted to continue their work in secret faced additional challenges. Without access to academic resources, commercial funding, or peer review, they were forced to work in isolation with limited resources. Many made crucial mistakes that could have been avoided through collaboration with other scientists, while others became so secretive that their discoveries died with them. Some inventors attempted to preserve their knowledge by encoding it in seemingly unrelated patents or hiding it in plain sight within conventional electrical designs. Tesla himself was known to have included hints about wireless power transmission in his patents for conventional electrical devices, hoping that future researchers might decode his intentions and continue his work. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful. The knowledge of how to build practical free energy devices was scattered and lost, buried in forgotten documents, or encoded in ways that made it inaccessible to later researchers. The institutional memory of how these technologies worked vanished along with the inventors who created them. The economic analysis of what was lost reveals the staggering magnitude of the suppression. Conservative estimates suggest that wireless power transmission technology could have reduced global energy costs by orders of magnitude, while simultaneously eliminating much of the infrastructure required for electrical distribution. The savings in materials, labor, and environmental cleanup costs would have amounted to trillions of dollars over the course of the 20th century. More importantly, the availability of abundant, free energy would have enabled technological developments that were impossible within the constraints of expensive, centralized power systems. Manufacturing processes that required enormous amounts of electricity became economically viable. Transportation systems based on wireless power could have eliminated much of the pollution and resource depletion associated with fossil fuel consumption. Agricultural applications of free energy could have revolutionized food production, making possible vertical farming systems and advanced hydroponic facilities that would have eliminated hunger and reduced the environmental impact of agriculture. Medical applications of atmospheric energy devices might have led to therapeutic technologies that could have prevented or cured diseases that killed millions of people throughout the 20th century. The technological development that did occur in the absence of free energy technologies was often distorted by the need to work within the constraints of expensive, centralized power systems. Engineers and inventors were forced to focus on efficiency improvements and cost reductions rather than pursuing more fundamental innovations that might have been possible with abundant energy. The computer revolution of the late 20th century, for example, was driven partly by the need to minimize power consumption. If electricity had been freely available, computer designers might have pursued different approaches that emphasize capability rather than efficiency, potentially leading to more advanced artificial intelligence or quantum computing systems decades earlier than actually occurred. Space exploration was similarly constrained by energy limitations. Rocket propulsion systems were chosen partly because they didn't require external power sources, but wireless power transmission could have enabled electric propulsion systems that would have been far more efficient for interplanetary travel. The exploration of the solar system might have proceeded much more rapidly if spacecraft could have been powered by beamed energy from Earth or other planets. The medical implications of suppressed energy technologies extend beyond the direct health effects noted by early researchers. Advanced electrical systems could have power diagnostic and therapeutic equipment that was impossible within the constraints of conventional power distribution. High-energy medical devices that could cure cancer or regenerate damaged tissue might have been developed if abundant electricity had been available to power them. The educational system was fundamentally altered by the suppression of free energy knowledge. Students were taught a version of physics that excluded crucial information about atmospheric electricity, wireless power transmission, and other phenomena that had been demonstrated by suppressed inventors. This created generations of scientists and engineers who were literally unable to conceive of alternatives to centralized power systems. The implications for scientific progress were severe. Research that might have led to breakthrough discoveries in multiple fields was prevented by the institutional barriers erected to protect conventional energy technologies. Scientists who might have made revolutionary discoveries were instead channeled into incremental improvements to existing systems. The suppression also affected the development of environmental consciousness. If clean, abundant energy had been available from the beginning of the industrial age, the environmental movement might have focused on different issues or developed along different lines. The pollution and resource depletion associated with fossil fuel consumption might never have reached crisis levels, preventing the environmental degradation that characterized much of the 20th century. International relations were profoundly shaped by the absence of free energy technologies. Much of the geopolitical conflict of the past century was driven by competition for energy resources: oil, coal, natural gas, and uranium. Wars were fought over access to these resources, and international alliances were formed around energy security concerns. In a world where energy was abundant and freely available, these conflicts might never have occurred. Nations would not have needed to secure access to fossil fuel deposits or worry about energy independence. The entire structure of international relations might have developed along more cooperative lines, focused on shared technological development rather than resource competition. The Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union was partly driven by competition for energy resources and the technology to exploit them. Nuclear weapons were developed as an extension of nuclear power technology, and much of the space race was motivated by military applications of rocket technology. If abundant clean energy had been available from atmospheric sources, these deadly competitions might never have developed. The financial system itself was shaped by energy scarcity. Much of the debt-based monetary system that emerged during the 20th century was built around the need to finance large-scale energy infrastructure projects. Banks made enormous profits from loans for power plant construction, oil exploration, and electrical grid development. If energy infrastructure had been minimal due to wireless power transmission, the financial system might have developed along different lines. The concentration of wealth in the hands of energy companies and the banks that finance them might never have occurred, leading to a more equitable distribution of economic resources. The urban planning disasters of the 20th century, sprawling suburbs, polluted industrial districts, and energy-intensive transportation systems, were largely consequences of the need to distribute electrical power through centralized networks. Cities were designed around the constraints of electrical infrastructure rather than human needs or environmental considerations. Wireless power transmission could have enabled radically different approaches to urban design. Buildings could have been located based on aesthetic, social, or environmental factors rather than proximity to power lines. Industrial facilities could have been distributed in ways that minimized environmental impact while maximizing efficiency. The psychological and spiritual implications of energy abundance versus scarcity affected human consciousness in ways that are still being understood. Living within artificial constraints created mindsets of limitation and competition that might not have developed in a world of technological abundance. The knowledge that revolutionary technologies had been deliberately suppressed created cognitive dissonance in people who learned about it. The contradiction between what was possible and what was allowed created psychological stress that manifested as cynicism, paranoia, or despair about human institutions and technological progress. The inventors who experienced this suppression firsthand often developed profound philosophical insights about the relationship between technology, power, and human consciousness. Tesla's later writings revealed his understanding that technology alone was insufficient to create human progress, that social and spiritual development were necessary to ensure that technological capabilities were used for beneficial purposes. These insights were lost along with the suppressed technologies. The wisdom that came from grappling with the ethical implications of revolutionary technology was buried with the inventors who developed it. Subsequent generations of scientists and engineers were deprived of this philosophical foundation, leading to technological development that often ignored social and environmental consequences. The story of suppressed free electricity technologies reveals the critical importance of understanding technology as a social and political phenomenon rather than simply a matter of scientific discovery. The same forces that destroyed these technologies in the past continue to operate today, shaping which innovations are allowed to develop and which are suppressed or ignored. Understanding this history is essential for anyone seeking to comprehend the true potential of human technological achievement and the forces that have shaped our current world. The technologies that were destroyed represented not just alternative approaches to energy generation, but fundamentally different visions of how human society could organize itself around abundance rather than scarcity. The legacy of these suppressed technologies continues to influence contemporary debates about energy policy, technological development, and economic systems. The knowledge that alternatives were possible but deliberately prevented provides crucial context for understanding current limitations and possibilities for future development.